just say so.
Okay. Yeah, you might be on a bit of the quieter side, but all right, we're live. So if you can turn it up, that would be all right.
Well, I can try and move my microphone closer.
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay.
All right, folks. So we've got Lord Pasta here, and he wanted to offer up some maybe criticisms, maybe some just discussion about my model of morality specifically, and then maybe we'll talk about just morality in general. So why don't you introduce yourself and everything? Like, what's your thing?
So I'm Lord Pasta, and this is literally the first discussion specifically on like philosophical topics that I've done, like seriously. But on my channel, I do casual like gaming live streams. Sometimes people come in with their own objections, and I typically try and have discussions with them, but that's not really formal or anything. So I've been watching debates on the modern day debate for a long time. I recently saw Snake debate SJ, I think it was, not too long ago, about objective morality in a secular point of view, right? So it was kind of that way I was introduced with your argument. And I found it quite interesting because, I'm familiar with the typical Sam Harris approach and the Stefan Molyneux approach, but you seem to be doing an entirely different approach. Obviously, I disagree. I think we both disagree with both of those individuals' approach to proving an objective moral framework without a God. And I also 100% agree with your conclusion that even if you have a God, that still doesn't qualify objective morality because you're appealing to whatever a God says, not bridging the Azad gap. But I've since then watched some of your discussions you've done on your channel, and I've kind of tried to gather what your points are, what your premises are, and I think I've gotten some clear objections to some of those.
Okay.
So if you want, I can just go straight into that.
Yeah. And this is like version 3.0 that I
because
presented with SJ. So
I've seen some of your earlier arguments because I went back on your channel, and I also have sections on why those are wrong, but you probably don't need to hear that.
Okay.
So now I'm reading this from my text document. Now I come from the position of trying to understand an argument. My personal views on morality, as opposed to Snake's, are not relevant to my questioning, although it may be referenced. The important issue here is that I wish to understand his reasoning and be convinced of it as well. He is the one who claims morality is objective. So you're the one presenting the argument. I am simply objecting to the reasoning therein. So here I have, and correct me if I'm wrong, the premises from your most recent argument. And there are 9 of them, I believe, and a conclusion.
Yeah.
So premise 1, value is what something is good, aka useful for. You have that in brackets. So I would agree with premise 1, as the value of any object to me is determined, or to any person, that you could replace me with anyone, determined by how useful it is in achieving my desires. So I agree with premise 1. Premise 2 is value is objectively measurable. This is false as far as I can tell. Value seems to be entirely subjective in a descriptive external sense, since value can only exist as so far as it achieves my desires. It cannot be described as subjective. So What I mean by saying this is basically that to claim that the value of any given object is objectively measurable in of itself is kind of akin to saying that all ought statements are is statements, or trying to bridge the is-ought gap, basically with that statement there. Because value to me, even what something is useful for, is utterly irrelevant to the question of proving objective morality. So the fact of this like nail clipper like existing in the objective world, it has a use, an obvious one, to clip nails, but it also contains certain materials that can be used in other ways. And what decides what I will do with that object or any other given object is not inherent within that object. It is in my own mind. So I only use it to clip my nails if I find value in clipping my nails. Value, yes, it is what something is useful for, but it is also, but that is defined by the observer, the mind. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because I feel
I
like it could be
do.
clearer.
And yeah, I think, I mean, I might be doing myself a disservice by using the term value, and I'm not trying to equivocate with like uh, the way that I value personally something, because obviously there is a subjective form of value where I might value this book over, like, some people like the Lord of the Rings, some people do not like the Lord of the Rings, and uh, that would have a different subjective value. But what I'm talking about is, I guess, to stick with the same example, the Lord of the Rings, the value that I'm talking about is it is a story that can be enjoyed. And I
Okay,
think
I
it's
think
basically what it does. And that's kind of what I mean by usefulness, is whatever it does is what it's useful for.
okay. So I just want to understand what you're saying, is, so I'll try and repeat it back to you. So you're talking about a sense of value that is universal. So like the set of things that say this could do, right?
Yeah.
So like
Even the
the
materials in it.
even yes. Well, then my response to that would be, how then would you conclude any ought statement from the existence of properties? That's a hypothetical imperative, not a categorical one.
Hmm.
So that's
Well,
a
I think I've got an interesting way to bridge that, and I don't want to toot my own horn because I know that's been basically held to be impossible. Um, I'll get to that if you want, but maybe we
I
could go
mean,
through the first nine first, and
yes,
then
exactly. Because I
okay,
I have my responses to each premise here.
okay,
So that was premise 2.
Mhm.
Premise 3: the more a thing or collection of things is good for, the more degrees of freedom. So this is explaining more about the the property of a given thing and how many things it's useful for.
Mhm.
This is true. This is my response. This is true insofar as the more that a set of things allows me to do, the freer I become. This would, of course, have to do with one's definition of freedom, but that is a semantic argument. The more one can do, the freer they are. And if a thing allows one to do more, then it makes sense for them. It makes them more free.
Mhm.
Right. So I
And I
agree.
think this could apply to objects as well. Like the more malleable and the more states that an object or even its given components can take, I guess the freer the system. Like
Hmm. But
like if
I mean, I
something's just
guess.
stagnated in one form, that would be a less free system, or is stagnated to one usage, or is not very useful.
True, but the nature of the universe dictates that everything that exists necessarily must exist in that state, unless we go to things like quantum mechanics. So, which I guess you would define that as a very free system. But anything in objective reality, say if we had something that could be in like a million different ways, it's only going to ever be in one way. Like that's predetermined
I'm talking about
by the laws of the universe.
Like possible or potential conformations as well.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's possible given any other, but you see, you appeal to further is statements. So like the Earth could smash into Jupiter if the Earth were in a different location. Anything could be any other way based on if you change it in any logically coherent manner, right? So like an asteroid could crash into the Earth if there was an asteroid there, or the asteroid could instead hit the moon if the moon were in a different position. That's what I mean when I say that the universe necessarily, if we assume to make reality consistent, basal assumptions like scientific reasoning, the consistency of reality, the understandability of reality, we need to presume that there is a predetermined way for everything to be the way that it is. But when we talk about moral statements, which I don't think is necessarily even, something that's touched upon in premise 3, that is an ought statement, which to me comes from an entirely different place in the universe, I guess one could say.
Well, and there is kind of a descriptive element to this, like just the way things are. But I think the argument is much stronger if you have an ought. So I do try to do that as well.
I mean, if you could demonstrate, it's almost in the reason why somebody hearing like, and this is going out of what I've written down, obviously, but the reason why it's so hard to believe that morality is objective is because morality is ought statements, and obviously all that is an is statement. And as David Hume wrote, you cannot bridge the ought and the is. And when people attempt to in their mind, they can't even point to any ought statement that would rest in is statements, or any is statement that would result in ought statements. It's kind of incomprehensible to even conceive of that as a logical possibility. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. But it just kind of means that it's hard to comprehend that.
I did have a hard time. I was like, what does ought even mean when we say it?
That's another thing.
Yeah.
Because my conception of that could be entirely different from yours or anyone else's.
Yeah.
But we can move on.
But as far as like, the Earth could potentially crash into Jupiter, I think, there is the possibility of extrapolation, like, the nail clippers could become a gun if you like melted it down and combined it with other stuff. But I guess you're just talking about the potential of the materials in it. But
I mean, that was a totally different contention,
Yeah.
because you were talking about an inanimate object being free. And I don't necessarily even think that's something that's possible.
Well,
for the reasons I described earlier.
I guess I kind of try to focus on systems rather than particular objects, and objects themselves would be like mini systems. But I see more of the universe as a system that has freedom in the sense that it can rearrange itself into all these different degrees of arrangements. And
I mean, it could. That's
I guess
pure hypothetical, though. The universe
well,
could be any
at
number
any different time,
of ways.
any different time, I guess. But yeah, I am a determinist in that whatever confirmation it's taking now was determined by some other confirmation. But the the ability, like, you can't just magically transform carbon to like some other element just by like beating on it. Like, I mean, you might be able to do it in like CERN or something, but
Oh yeah, I 100% agree. But my point is that to say that something has multiple potentials has nothing to say about the one that the universe dictates it will be. And to
yeah.
appeal to any other circumstances to rearrange the order in which the universe has manifested itself.
No, I agree. And like for the Earth example, I would say that it's a freer planet, at least than most, because it is capable of supporting life, and I mean, and thus it kind of does support life. Uh, Lots of things could have gone wrong in that sequence of events that led to life, but it is capable of supporting this degree of freedom that isn't even a possibility on a lot of these other planets.
Yeah, I'm just this that you're referring to degree of freedom. It doesn't make sense as a useful term to me. I guess because to me, to say that an inanimate object is free is to go against determinism, which you said that previously you agreed with, and to say that
Yeah.
the Earth is more free. I mean,
Well, it's
are you
like,
just saying there's more that you don't know about the Earth, so it could be many different ways? I mean, the
I
Earth
guess
could
it's
have
more
had
like,
no life,
yeah,
but then you would just be rearranging the natural manifestation of the universe.
there's more ways in which you can rearrange the matter. Like on Jupiter, you could get gases and I don't know if, I don't think there's any, is there a solid part of Jupiter? Or is it just all gas?
There may be a solid part at the core, but we don't know at this moment.
Yeah. But anyway, the amount of arrangements of matter is higher on Earth than any of the other planets. Like we
Really,
have,
I don't know that that's true, but I could accept that for the sake of the argument. But even then, that wouldn't have
yeah.
anything to say about the freedom of Earth. I mean, the Earth could have been many different things, but in the end, it only is what it is. And this is an entirely different question from saying that the Earth ought to be any particular way.
Yeah, that is a different question.
It's entirely
Um,
different. Um, but
Even if you just define that as good, it's like, okay, that's just a label at that point.
yeah,
Which is
I
why I try
mean,
to bridge the ought gap.
yeah, to a certain extent, you can't even say that a human being is free if they're determined. But
Yeah,
one always, in my philosophical outlook, says that they are free. And
but I
but
guess,
that's
yeah.
my philosophy. But that's
Well, what
irrelevant
I
here.
mean is, the things that a human is capable of doing is higher than the things that a rock is capable of doing.
I mean,
Like by itself, if you take rocks as a
yeah,
whole, rocks are a prerequisite for human life. So,
oh yeah.
but if you're just taking one individual human and one individual rock, one
But
has a higher degree of freedom
there are
because it
things
can
that
do more.
rocks can do that humans can't do. Like the Earth is technically, one could
Hmm.
consider it a massive rock, and it can, you know, it has the
Yeah.
power to have gravity to attract the moon. A human
Hmm.
being can't do that just by their physical nature.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is literally not relevant to the question at all,
Okay.
because I would agree that that I am free the more possible things that I can do, but I would not agree that a rock is free or a system is more free if it's composed entirely of things that are not my mind, right? So in a
So,
sense, I would agree with that premise, but um, yeah, I make a distinction between my mind and the external reality because I believe that's the only way to come to an understanding of one's existence. I
would you
use
say would you say you needed an element of choice in order to use the word freedom appropriately?
Yes, I would say
Okay.
so.
I mean, me as a determinist, I kind of don't see a difference between, because I
I
think every
see what
choice
you're
is
saying.
determined.
I
You know.
see what you're saying. But for the sake of the argument, I agree with the premise because
Okay.
for well actually, I mean I guess so. Yeah, I agreed with the premise in my analysis initially.
Okay.
So I don't see, and I don't think it's important whether I object or accept that premise anyways. Um, so premise 4 is existence is good for more than non-existence. Um, I would agree with that.
Okay.
So we can just move on.
Yeah, and I think premise 5 is pretty similar to premise 3. I'm just trying to be more specific, and maybe it's superfluous. I'm not sure.
I mean, I respect the the attempt of making your argument more understandable. So it's always a good thing.
Yeah.
The more things exist, the more the more the system is good for, the more freedom it has. So this is saying that the more like multitude of things in existence that exist, the more that those things can do, obviously, and so the more freedom it can be said to have. Generally, this
Mhm.
is true. And so I kind of, the more that I think about it, the more that I see where you're coming from in premise 3. And
Okay.
the more that I see where I'm maybe just taking a different semantic, you know, definition of freedom, which I tried to
Mm.
guard against when I wrote this. So I can agree that you can define freedom in a way in which this statement is true, that it is more free for a system, the more possible things that it can do, right?
Yeah.
Given
And I
anything.
Yeah. And I personally value freedom, but I didn't start with these words and work backwards. Like I was trying to describe what I was thinking of, and I was like, well, to me, freedom seems like the best word, and it kind of just landed in my lap almost, and I was like, well, that lines up with my value, but I'm trying not to end up where I want to go necessarily. Um,
Hmm.
but it did. I can't think of any other word really that would describe the the all possible states that a given system can take other than freedom. And
I
I'm
guess so.
trying not to conflate that with like the idea of like liberty or things like that, although I think you can derive them uh,
Hmm.
from this conclusion.
Yeah. Uh, Generally, when engaging in arguments, it can be very hard to semantically define things
Mm-hmm.
in a manner to where most people agree with it, or gather
Yeah.
some understanding from it. So, yeah, and these are a lot of things that when I try to argue with people, I'm not very good at. I'll just like say I'll say like three premises and a conclusion, and it'll be valid, it'll be sound, but like no one will understand what I'm saying because like it's so unclear with only three premises that
Yeah.
anybody would be like, what does that even mean? Um, but I have this whole thing that I wrote out for premise 5 after I agreed with it. Says, but it is important to note that it is not just the quantity of things which increase the goodness of a system. And this I'm using goodness the way you define it.
Mhm.
It is specifically their usefulness. So, again, how you defined goodness. Having a pet is a thing you can have, but keeping that pet alive can reduce the amount of other things you can do. One does
Mhm.
not have to take care of the pet. The animal would have to exist for the choice of owning it to be an option, but its mere existence requires other things. We could get into the weeds with this, but it is largely irrelevant. So I think you get what I'm saying there, right?
Well, I think
So,
that's the most complex part, because it's like you have to balance out, okay, well, the pet exists, but then that lowers the amount of stuff that I can do, or the amount of stuff I can have in my house if the pet chews up a bunch of stuff. And so I think that's where a lot of the balancing act comes in with ethics.
yeah.
Is
And
like,
I
how
would agree with all
exactly
this.
how do we actually figure out which has the higher level of freedom?
I would definitely 100% agree with that sort of line of reasoning, because there is a best possible way of getting what you want in the world. There are things that can give you more things than other things. And the more things that give you more things for more people, the more that more people can do objectively. That is true. I 100% agree. But to get from that is statement to an ought statement, that's where the real problem comes in. And I think you're starting to see that's where my objection is.
That's the hardest part. But yeah.
So premise 6, some behaviors can raise or lower the degrees of freedom in a system. I agree with this. So we don't need to discuss that really that much.
Okay.
And premise 7, a set of behavioral standards, ethics, can be rationally consistent with reality and logic. And so I said, this is true, as anything which is not breaking the laws of logic can be consistent with logic, and people both adhere and disadhere to ethic structures and reality. So it's not contradictory to reality or logic. So I agree with premise 7. And premise
basically 8. Well, what I'm trying to say here is, like, there could be an ethic that contradicts itself.
Oh yeah,
contradict itself, or that
that's
contradict.
100% true.
Okay. Was that clear from that, or maybe I could reword that?
Give me a minute.
Because I guess I could see someone saying, like, oh, well, the ethic to murder babies could be consistent with reality if you murder babies, or something like that.
Yeah, it's possible to conceive of a system of ethics that is in contradiction to itself. And for a system of ethics, or morality for that matter, to contradict itself would make all of morality inherently unknowable, because all that is illogical is inherently unknowable. So you wouldn't want that, unless you would want that, unless you don't want to know, but that's totally different.
Yeah.
So premise 8 is another interesting premise. Objectivity is mind independent. So you're just saying that reality, whatever it is that which is not in the mind, or something that is different from the mind.
Yeah.
So I would generally agree with this, but my philosophical understanding is that reality is a model of understanding sensory stimulus. Whether or not it is wholly within my mind or without my mind is kind of irrelevant to the fact that it exists separate from things which are entirely of my mind, right? So one can make a distinction between objectivity and my mind, even if one holds to a weak solipsism, which I do. So I say objectivity is anything which occurs in reality. Reality is a model which I use to describe and understand sensory experiences. If you hear anything I say that is just irrational.
Yeah. I mean, I would obviously we can only have models of reality because we're fallible creatures who have monkey brains, but I think there is a distinction between reality and our our model of reality, but
There can be
we
no
can
way
get close. But yeah,
that there can be no way of concluding that. So how can you assert that?
of concluding that there's a reality outside of mind.
Yes, there's other than a model of reality, other than an assumption that reality exists. You can't be certain because the model just assumes that reality exists and is comprehensible. The existence of sensory experience doesn't prove the existence of an underlying reality to compare that model with, because dreams are another contrary sensory experience, or hallucinations are sensory experiences which are contrary to our vision of reality. So they don't prove other realities. They don't disprove reality. So
I think
I think
even
the
if
base. I'm sorry, but what I'm trying to
go
say
ahead.
is the base level is that reality is simply a model of understanding, and to say that there is, of course, if you believe in the model, you would say that it exists.
Yeah,
But to say that the
well,
model and reality exist separately and are somehow the same, that to me that just kind of doesn't make any sense, because like the model is reality, like, you know.
well, I mean, I would definitely agree that we can only work with the model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I would think even if the reality that we know of is the product of a mind, there has to be something governing that mind that's happening outside of the product of that mind. And
How do you know that?
um, well, then otherwise the mind is just
How the mind could be all that is.
existing out of nowhere.
That's possible,
Like,
because you're now in the realm of you're now, this is a meta claim. I mean, you could assert that. You can assert anything as a descriptive model, but if your assertion of a mind controlling reality serves no function, then it's just kind of an assertion, right?
yeah. Well, I
So
think
it's the
I'm,
simplest solution to just assume the model of reality, and that's just one assertion that you need.
yeah. Well, that is what I'm
But
basically
that
referencing.
model could be in a mind. Could be. It could not be. You
I
can't know
think
that it is or isn't.
where I would object to that is kind of along the lines of a bootstrapping problem where some form of reality or existence must exist for a mind to create existence, which means that the mind didn't
That's
create
just an
existence.
assertion. Maybe the
Well,
mind did create existence. You can't know that.
well, but then it would have already existed. So,
No, maybe the mind just came into existence as soon as all that it experienced came into existence. Maybe it was one and the same. Or you could make any number of assumptions surrounding why you came into existence other than reality. I subscribe to reality as a model. I think you do also. You
mhm.
know, I mean, that's the most rational one, but there are also like irrational ones excluding reality. One could assume a god. One could assume we're in a simulation.
Yeah,
One could
which
assume that,
simulation's hard to argue against sometimes. But
yeah, true.
I
But
yeah,
what
I
was it that
still
you were
don't know
saying? Like,
about what?
there was something that you said. It was like the bootstrapping problem that I just didn't.
Oh yeah.
That was just an assertion that something reality had to exist for the mind to exist, and so
Well,
that proves the model of reality. I don't think that that's.
or existence, something would have to uh, already exist for a mind to exist in order for
Yeah, that's just an
existence to be
assumption.
derived from the mind.
But if you can assume that given the model of reality, but that's as far as you can go. You can't know that any more than you can know the model of reality is true.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
So
that's based on how we understand reality works, basically. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that your earlier statement of trying to compare the model of reality to the natural existence of things is nonsensical, because obviously it's just an assumption. It's one that works. It's the most rational one for understanding sensory experience, but it's not reflective of any inherent reality, like greater truth than that. There's no greater truth in terms of reality than the model conception of reality that we have.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by greater truth.
Because I
basically,
do
I'm just
than the existence of reality. But
well, I'm kind of just referring to whatever happens, whatever is true, if there's no human race or no life at all. Like there's still, like if a tree falls in the woods, does it still make a sound?
Well, you assume that it does based on the model of reality.
Yeah.
But that's just a model.
Yeah. And we are stuck in the model of reality. But
exactly. All we have is the model of reality.
Yeah. So what would you say objective was?
Objectivity is all that which is in reality, which is a model. Objectivity is all that which is in the model of reality. And I don't even necessarily think that necessarily means it's mind independent, because the model of reality is just in my mind. So I believe that it's something external to my mind based on that model, but the model itself exists in my mind. So objectivity is just anything in that model.
Yeah. Or, I mean, it's usually defined also as like not influenced by personal feelings or opinions and just considering facts, which I think is just kind of a roundabout way to say what we've been saying, I guess.
Yeah, because that's the way you come to truths in the model of reality. Objectively. It's kind of confusing because I read what I wrote down here, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't fully, describe what I'm trying to say. And so I feel like I have this problem where I say things that are like really complex, but nobody can actually understand what they mean, not even myself. And so I'm just like, oh, what did I even say?
Oh yeah, it's hard to articulate what because you can feel what you think you know, but then it's hard to put in words.
Yeah, because look, I'm not smart in any way. I just like to think about this a lot, probably to an unhealthy level. But trying to parse through all of this is really freaking crazy.
Yeah.
But I guess we can move on from that. Premise 8.
All right.
Premise 9. No preferences or gods are used in evaluating how much a thing is good for. And I said in response, no. How useful a thing is dependent upon one's preference, is my contention, basically. So there can exist things which can be useful for a greater number of things, right? But inherently, there are some things which are more useful for specific things, or things that are not useful for some things, and things which are only useful for other things that are not included in other sets of things, right? So in all of existence, there exist things that can do things, okay? This is things that can do things exist. Now, the amount of things that a thing can do could be any number, and we both agree with the proposition, the premise, that there exists both things that do multiple things and things which do other things which are not included in those things that the others do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And so what determines then, how can we determine then from that what we ought to do if there are things which exist, that there doesn't exist a thing that can do everything, right? Unless you want to propose that as existing, or as the universe.
Yeah,
If you want to say the universe can do everything, but that's just an assertion.
That's kind of like why I like using the term system, because a thing is just like a concept. Like it's just the particular arrangement of those atoms or quarks that we're recognizing in a category.
I understand.
Yeah.
But a system is still a thing. So this is,
yeah.
I use generalized language for the reason that you can draw a circle around as many galaxies as you want, and that's still a thing, and it still can do X number of things.
Yeah.
Like it can do things in that area, and even to a larger degree outside of that area, it can influence. But it can never influence something like all the way, like so far away from it, right? Unless you draw an even bigger circle, then you have the problem just continues exponentially. Unless you appeal to everythingness.
Yeah. If you consider the universe as one thing, then I guess that can do everything.
Can do everything.
Unless there's like a multiverse or something like that.
And so I guess then the only refutation of that would be to say that the one thing that the universe cannot do is not exist.
Yeah.
And then you could have people commit suicide, and they believe that the universe should not exist, so they kill themselves. But they wouldn't have any control over the universe existing or not existing. They would just have control over their experience. But maybe that's so unbearable that they say, "Oh, the universe ought not to exist," as a moral proposition, which some people like hold rationally, like they rationalize that position.
Well, I think like existence versus non-existence is kind of central in a lot of this, and I think the way that I understand non-existence is like someone said, well, non-existence could be good for things not existing, and to me that kind of doesn't make sense, because non-existence doesn't do anything. Not existing isn't actually a thing. It's the absence of doing something.
True.
Does that make sense?
True. But to say that something ought not exist is a proposition that one can hold, and I believe that even you would agree that unjustified killing ought not exist morally.
Yeah.
And so that's a ought not exist statement that you hold to be true. And so likewise, one could logically hold the position that everything ought not exist. They could say that. They could believe that even.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be correct, but
I would disagree also. but here's the thing that this model of understanding objective morality can't explain. It can't explain why it can't explain why someone could even possibly hold that position.
Could hold that we ought to exist, or
that things ought not exist, because inherent in this argument is the fact that the more things that can be done in a system, the greater moral value it has, because the more things that any person can find valuable in it, right? But if somebody said that nothing ought to exist, then any system existing can't do that, right?
Yeah. And
It's a contradiction with existence itself.
I think nothing ought exist is kind of a contradiction.
Why?
Well, I don't think you can derive an ought from non-existence. So,
what if non-existence is an ends in of itself?
An
end.
It might be the end, but
And somebody holds rationally that all ought not exist. Someone could say that. Someone could even believe that. Obviously, we disagree with it, but one could hold that preference. And it appears to me that your moral system appeals to any system which can maximize the amount of preferred states of being. And there always will be certain states of matter which can do only certain things, and certain states of matter, states of matter, things which can do other things that those other ones can't do. And so any person with any desire would have to make a choice as to which object they went with or which thing they created, right?
Yeah.
There would be no objective thing to tell them which one is the best to do. And at the baseline, if you agree that it is possible for someone to desire non-existence, you would have to conclude that there is no way for there to be a system which satisfies every desire. And so, therefore, this idea that there is a maximal, optimum way of existing based on possible states of existences is not true.
Well, I think that my model would justify suicide under certain contexts, for sure. Whereas, like, it's your own choice. I think it might depend on how many people you hurt in that process, but
that there could exist a person who desires. It's not just suicide, because now you're conflating suicide with what I was saying earlier, which is somebody who holds to the desire that all ought not exist. All which exists ought not exist. And any system, even all existence, cannot not exist. So there can, at the base level, when talking about ought claims, because anyone can say an ought claim.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you're attempting to find some basis in the universe, right? Which, if you go through that path, if you preserve certain things existing, then everybody can achieve like everything that they want, right? Everybody can achieve all their collective oughts, all. Well, right. I mean, that sounds absurd, but, and please tell me if I'm misrepresenting, but
I specifically don't care about preferences or desires in this model, because obviously that could be wrong. Like, that's the whole point of morality, is to say, okay, well, if you desire to kill a baby or kill an innocent person, that's wrong. And there must be some basis in that. And I think the simplest way is to be like, oh, well, if you do that, you're a hypocrite. Okay, well then, but why should I care if I'm being a hypocrite? And so I think we can go deeper than that. did you have any problems with the conclusion? And then I'll get into my ought is thing.
Yeah, so the conclusion is moral statements are not objective. Or wait, no, that's my thing. Conclusion, therefore, moral value, aka goodness, can be measured objectively by degrees of freedom, and thus moral and ethical statements can be true. And I say I disagree because I object to premise 2 and 9. But insofar as the conclusion, you're appealing to degrees of freedom. Now, why do you appeal to degrees of freedom in your argument? It is a question of because something, the more free it is, the more possibilities it has. Now, one could then ask why in your argument is the more possibilities good? And you would respond because the more possibilities something has, the more outcomes that can be derived therein, and I guess somehow that's universally preferable, which it isn't, which was my objection. Sorry,
yeah, well,
I was unclear with that, and
yeah. So I took a bit of inspiration from like Stefan Molyneux's universally preferable behavior, but my problem was, and I think it's a good idea, but I really object to his use of preference because obviously preference is not objective. So
I think there is a way of acting in the world which will make the most people satisfied and content and lead to the most amount of well-being for the world. But I don't think that that's objective. I don't think that that's an ought from an is. I wouldn't call that objective morality. I would simply justify that as a preference, because I prefer the world to be good for me because I exist in the world, and making people happy is an ends in of itself for me. I derive pleasure from making other people happy. So I have I go on further in this text document, and I say, it seems clear to me that in order for something to be objective, it must exist within reality, the model. Since morals exist purely in my mind, they cannot be objective. So for this, I have premise 1. What is objective is that which exists in reality. Premise 2, ought statements exist in my mind, not in reality. And premise 3, all moral claims require ought claims. And conclusion is moral statements are not objective. Right. So this is directly contrary to the conclusion that you derive.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously, clearly, you would have to disagree with either the validity or the soundness of my argument.
So I think that ought statements do exist in reality, and so I'll go through that real quick, I guess.
I mean, that's what the argument above was supposed to prove, but I don't think it did that.
Yeah, I don't either. I think that that's purely descriptive.
It's
and
hypothetical imperatives, which are very useful. I would agree 100%.
I think that it is important to know, like, what am I referring to when I say good? But basically, I don't think it goes far enough. So I had to figure out what ought even means, because I was like, I really didn't understand when I say you ought to do this. It's like we intuitively understand what it means, but so it was hard to kind of paraphrase. So I just went and got the dictionary definition, and so basically it says an ought indicates an obligation or correctness of a thing. And so right away I seized on the correctness.
Yeah, because that's your that's your I have down here your original argument. Here, wait a second. Premise 1, two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time. Premise 2, something cannot ever result from nothing. Premise 3, something exists. Conclusion, true absolute total nothingness or non-existence is logically incoherent and therefore necessarily must and ought to exist. That was the one that I
Oh yeah,
saw
that
there,
was
which
that was my original
is,
ought from an is, and I think that holds true.
you
But
think that holds
it's
true?
yeah,
Like, wait a second. So when you say it holds true, that means you think its conclusion is true, not that it's sound or valid.
yeah, I
Because
guess. Yeah, I mean, do you have
not
problems with that one?
it's not sound or valid at all.
Okay.
Well, I think
Um,
it might be one. I don't know. Uh,
well, the reason I kind of moved on from that is I didn't think it helped me much because it's like, okay, well, maybe existence ought to exist, but where do we kind of just would have to extrapolate and say other things ought to exist, but I don't
I
know if that
can read my
follows.
response to it if you
Yeah,
want.
yeah.
The argument above does not convince me of anything other than the existence of something, because not nothingness existing is kind of a contradiction, because a true philosophical nothingness is kind of illogical because nothing is something, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Firstly, it appears to me that it could be wrong in my understanding, and if I am, I will quickly accept logical necessities to be conflating must with ought, because must and ought are very clearly not the same thing. Because when David Hume says there's a distinction between is and ought statements, the ought refers to something very specific. It's a moral impetus. It is a desire. Like the example that's given is a tree. You walk up to a tree. Now, you could do any number of things with the knowledge that a tree exists. You could walk past the tree. You could sit under its shade. You could cut down the tree. And then once you cut it down, you could make a number of given things out of the wood. But nothing in the existence of that tree tells you which course of action to take, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where was I? If the argument is not conflating must with ought, then the ought and the must be separate, and therefore each needs to be proven. The contention that total philosophical nothingness is incoherent would logically lead us to the conclusion that something must exist. This would be expressed as something is. What in this argument proves the ought is a mystery to me, because we have premise 1, two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time. That's law of non-contradiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with that, obviously. Premise 2, something cannot ever result from nothing. So something cannot ever result from nothing. Well,
Which
I've
is kind
never.
of to say total philosophical nothingness can do nothing. It has no traits, that nothing ever results from it.
Well, that's like saying that something that's incomprehensible can never create anything, but I would not. That's just an assertion, because I've never seen anything that's like logically incomprehensible to be able to prove whether that's a false statement or true statement. So, right, like
Well, I guess
we
maybe I
ever
need to define it, but it's like the
like
total absence of any qualities whatsoever.
that's like saying a square circle can never make can never make a dog. It's like, well, a square circle can never is like something that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. And premise 3, something exists. Well, I agree with all the premises, so I guess I was wrong. It is sound, but it's just not valid, because the conclusion that therefore something ought to exist from that is a mystery. Where you get the ought statement from? It's like two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time. Yes, that is true. That is true. Premise 2, something cannot ever result from nothing. Yeah, something is. And then premise 3, something exists. That's just a restatement of premise 2. So something is again. Well, it's not an exact restatement, but you get what I'm saying. What in that logically leads to ought? No clue, other than you must be conflating must with ought, which I would never ascribe to anybody, but I guess that is what you did. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I guess I wrote must and ought, but I guess I kind of was conflating them.
Because just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be.
Yeah, because I wasn't really. I guess I wasn't using ought correctly.
You could say that all that is ought to be. You could hold that position.
Yeah.
But like nobody does, and it would just be the same as any other position because of the is ought gap.
Yeah. So going back to the definition of ought, I think we could stop there and say, okay, well, ought just means the correctness of something. But I
would not say that at all.
Okay.
Because an is statement can be correct, but the is statement being correct or incorrect is no moral impetus other than what you define.
Well,
to correctness or incorrectness. One could say all things ought be incorrect. Now, I don't know what that would mean, but one psychologically hold that position.
Well, if you take the definition of ought as correctness, that would be a contradiction. But I was kind of like, I was satisfied with that, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't like using like an odd usage of the word. Yeah. So it would be an obligation or the correctness. So I wanted to explore obligation. I was like, okay, what does it really mean to say that you're obligated? What are we actually talking about?
Someone could be obligated based off of their circumstances, right? Is that impossible? Because, and that way, someone could be locked in a prison. Someone in prison says, I ought be free. Right? Are they like, is that like irrational? I don't think it is. Maybe they're innocent.
No.
Maybe we would all agree that they ought to be free, but they're still in prison.
Yeah.
I feel like you are kind of confused by the concept of oughtness. Or
I may be, yeah.
But and believe ought statements are. These are some of the things that when you find out about them, your brain just goes, bam! Like, holy crap! I never thought about it like that. Like when I was 16 and I found out about the is ought gap, it was just like, wow, everything makes sense now. So basically, and this is my conception of what oughtness refers to. Oughtness is what ought to be, right? So I'm sitting in my chair and I'm having a pretty good time, but my mouth is dry from talking so much. And I think that there ought to be some water other than this caffeinated substance that's just making me really awake at an hour that I don't really want to be. So I would say there ought to be water, right, for me to drink. I would say there ought to be food for me to eat. There ought to be things for me to derive pleasure from. And what controls an ought statement is literally, it's literally unprovable, because what ought to be just ought to be. And it's just as simple as that. It's just like experience just is. It's one of those things you can't prove to other people. I exist. I just do. Now, I can never ultimately prove that I exist to you, and likewise, through the model of reality and theory of minds, I assume that you can't ultimately prove that I exist to yourself, but we accept that we both exist, regardless.
Well, I mean, the way I conceive of that is, even if for somehow, whatever it means to say that everything that I'm seeing is just occurring within my mind, there must be some fraction or
Well, that's
part
not
of
what
my
I'm
mind
saying.
that is you. You know what I'm
That's
saying?
not the position I hold at all. But I'm just saying that there are some things that are literally just true because they're true. And that's a hard pill to swallow for anyone who's secular, which I am. I'm agnostic, by the way. But fundamentally, you have to agree that I think, therefore I am doesn't prove anything to anybody other than yourself. And experience, the thing that you use to build your model of reality, ultimately experience just is. Like, I'm the only person in my room right now. Obviously, I can show you this and you can say it exists, but I really only believe that it exists because I'm feeling it, and I can't interpret or intuit any other way that's more rational to explain the sensory data I'm experiencing other than the existence of this. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think certainly those sensations exist.
Yes, that's what I mean. But you can't prove the sensations exist to anyone other than yourself. And that's the point. The point is, some things just are. And at the end of the day, morality is just one of those things. Moral impetus and will is just one of those things that just are. It just is. Like, I want to have a comfortable life because I just do. Now, do I also want certain things that may lead to my life being uncomfortable? Yes. And in my mind, I would have to make a judgment as to which is more moral for me. Is fighting for freedom, knowing that I may be killed, something that I really desire more than living a safe life? Well, I would say so, because I'm just so self-important that if I was killed fighting for something that was just, I would just feel really satisfied with that. But a lot of people wouldn't. And at the end of the day, what is moral is literally just, and this sounds really egotistical, but I can't think of any other way to express it. What is morally right is what I say it is. Right? And likewise for any other mind, given the theory of mind and reality. But that's not as like hedonistic or like relativistic as people assume it is. I reject moral relativism for all of its logical inconsistencies as much as anyone else does. And also, I don't think that morality can just be anything either. Because if I claim that it is wrong to take something which is defined as someone's property without their consent, and then I also say, yeah, but you can if you wear like a red hat on Saturday, then I'm in contradiction with myself. And if I'm in contradiction with what I believe in myself, I can't comprehend anything of what I believe ought to be. And so I do believe that morality should be consistent with itself. I just believe that any logically consistent set of moral principles is equally valid, right? It's a very, sad conclusion to come to, because as human beings, we want to be able to say, we so desperately want to be able to say, I'm right. And there's some idea in debate, in the discourse, to where if me and you have a long enough discussion with enough evidence, we can just agree on everything. We can converge on the truth. But the reality is, on moral questions, and even on is questions, a lot of the time, sometimes people just diverge, and there's no way to agree, because one person is right just because they are, and the other person is right just because they are. It's a sad truth to realize, but it is. It's the world we live in.
Well, I think definitely what you were saying about any ethic that's kind of consistent with itself is kind of where I started with this. And for a while, I thought that was good enough, where like you could call that objective, like, because it's not
No, you can't.
necessarily dependent on your preferences or anything, but it is because it's adhering to this like law of non-contradiction. Like at least that
I
part of it is
get what you're
objective.
saying. I get what you're saying. You can call it objective, because I called it objective for like 2 years.
Okay.
But the thing is, what I refer to, it's true. Morality, the truth value of morality statements. I'm not an error theorist or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Moral statements can have truth or false values. But my contention is simply that is not defined by anything in objective morality, because the common understanding of objective morality doesn't include things. Objective reality doesn't include things like what I'm talking about, right? So in my mind space, I guess, in a way to express it, I guess to be more precise, is off here in one corner of my mind exists reality as a concept. And then off here in a totally different corner exists morality in another realm. And the two just don't really, they interact with each other insofar as morality describes how I can achieve things in reality, which I like. But other than that, they're not really related at all. And so calling one objective just because it's true isn't really a statement that anyone can make, or I can make. I might say it's true. Like if somebody's like trying to tell me that, oh, yeah, it's just my culture to like kill babies if they have birth defects, you're wrong. You are wrong. You are morally wrong. I will say that. And there is nothing in objective reality to tell you or me that you are wrong or right. It is simply self-evident to me. Maybe not to you, or probably not to you, but to me it is self-evidently true that killing babies just because they have birth defects is wrong, and saying that it's just your culture is not a justification. And so eventually you just have to get to the point where there's nothing in objective reality to say that either of us is right. It's simply true in of itself, and the only thing I can do about it is physically oppose you. It's the only option left. And so you would have to have another role of morals concerning when it's justified to enact violence, and so on and so forth. So
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I would agree that it's self-evidently true, but I wouldn't base that on just because I feel like it is. Like there would be like a rational reason why it is.
You want there to be, but there isn't. Just like we want to say that we exist to ourselves. We want to believe that we exist. But the only reason we believe that we exist is because we do. Right? And we all believe that's valid. Like, we could never doubt our own existence. I'm not saying that morality is merely a feeling. In fact, I'm elevating morality to the level of one's own existence. I think, therefore I am. You can't doubt your own existence. Same way you can't doubt morality. Right? If something is good, it's just good in of itself to you, obviously not to someone who disagrees, but they're wrong. You're right, just because you are.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem with that is they'll say the exact opposite and say that they're right just because they.
It's a sad reality we live in, but they're wrong, and ultimately.
But then, what does wrong and right even mean at that point?
Wrong in that sense means that they hold a position which is not true. Same as wrong in any descriptive sense. So, like, if somebody said, if you and me were walking down the street and you saw a cat and I saw no cat and we were looking exactly the same place, and you walked up to the cat, you touched it and you felt it, and I walked up to the cat and I felt nothing, we could never agree on whether or not a cat existed or not. We could never agree. We just go into infinity disagreeing if there was a cat there. And that could never be resolved. Right? Just could never be resolved.
Yeah, but one
that's
person is correct.
Yeah, but
and
who's
one person
correct?
is incorrect.
You would say you're correct. I would say I'm correct.
Yeah, but there is a. I mean, the truth may not be accessible to either of us, but one person is correct. Like, in the objective reality, there either is a cat or there isn't.
There could be a dog.
Well, then the person who says it's a cat is wrong, right?
Then they're both wrong.
Yeah, I guess if the one person was saying there's nothing there. But
yeah, one person says there's nothing there, one person says it's a cat. They can't both be right. Right?
Yeah.
But they could both be wrong.
Yeah.
Or one could be right. So there are like three possibilities. Both could be wrong. One could be wrong and the other could be right, and the other could be wrong and the other could be right. So three outcomes. But at the end of the day, that's very analogous to moral arguments, because at the end of the day, most moral arguments reduce down to a simple disagreement in moral axioms. So self-existent, self-proving premises, right? They're just held to be true. One person holds the axiom that a cat's there in some sense. The other one doesn't. And they can argue forever about every detail of that area. They'll never agree on whether or not there's a cat there. Never agree. But in terms of moral statements, it's even crazier, because moral statements are the things that you want to be able to, like, if anything is statements, we can disagree on like everything, and like that doesn't matter. Like we can disagree. Like one person could believe the earth is flat, so what?
Yeah.
Who cares? But in moral statements, that's what defines people's actions. So we want everybody to agree. Like that matters. Like if somebody believes that X group should be genocided, like that's wrong, But you can't convince them. You want so bad. It would be so easy to, if there was a way to convince somebody who believed an untrue perspective. We want that so bad, but you just can't. At the end of the day, you just have to appeal to basically just opposing them in their attempt to enact that.
Yeah, I think compelling someone is different than being correct. And that might be kind of what you're talking about.
Hmm. Yeah.
Richard, hey, what's going on, Richard? He says, Richard Madsen, of course, shout out. He says your utopia includes a chaotic form of subjective morality where anything anyone believes is acceptable. Thereby, you should not be able to object to someone taking away your freedoms. And
How is it that I hold to that position?
well, if everyone is just correct,
In a descriptive sense, but that's only it's only within the descriptive reality. I'm saying that morals exist at a higher level of truth than reality. That's my contention. They
higher
exist. They're
than
as
ourselves or
true,
higher than reality?
higher than I think, like equal to ourselves, equal to experience in of itself, right? Through my analogy with the cat, that can be understood, because ultimately, what the cat model describes is how ultimately reality is to a great extent subjective.
Yeah, our
What?
access certainly is.
Yeah,
Um,
perception is reality. The model of understanding that we come to about reality is right. Like we create the model based on what we experience. At the end of the day, I agree with science
yeah.
because it corroborates my experience, and it goes on and describes things I've never experienced. I trust science because it's been right about so much.
Mhm.
You know, and so at a lower level of truth, I believe things like quantum mechanics and stuff like that. I still believe it. It's just at a lower level of truth,
Hmm.
because no one else can propose a more abductively true art like model.
Hmm.
Um, and So this relates to morality in the sense that morality is, as I said before, something which is just self-evident, much like experience. Um, Moral impetus just like one's existence just is, or just like um, one's experiences
Yeah.
just are.
Well,
You know?
I guess I would agree, but I think that there's a correct impetus and an incorrect impetus,
So do
and
I.
someone who asserts
So do
something
I.
can be correct or incorrect.
That's exactly my position. Like
Okay.
if somebody,
Well, maybe calling it objective might be the wrong way to go about it. Maybe I would just say it's real or it's true. I guess moral realism would be the position of objective morality, unless I'm wrong.
I think so. I'm
Um,
like I said, I'm no genius or anything. I only go off of what I see in arguments or hear um, around in my crappy discussions I have with people, like off the cuff live stream events and stuff like that.
yeah, you do like Discord and stuff, right?
Oh yeah, I'll have people tell me all kinds of crazy things. One
Yeah,
person told me that a square triangle can exist.
yeah. You can't reason with those kind of people.
Yeah, it was,
But
somehow that got into the fourth dimension, and somehow the fourth dimension meant that like a square triangle existed. I
oh
don't,
yeah,
I
well,
don't know, man.
yeah, that's just law of identity type of stuff.
Yeah,
Um, but going back to like what an ought means, I think I can maybe explain it a little better.
yeah,
So
because
like going back to obligation, I kind of just try and break it down as painstakingly as possible. So like I also just looked up the definition for obligation and I just kept doing this. So basically, the obligation or an obligation is the condition of being bound to something, or whether it's like morals or like legal or by that. Um, And it's like, okay, you're not physically bound to obey it. So what does that mean? And so it's really just, it's not a material constraint, but it's some kind of regulatory constraint,
Yeah.
or statutory.
I don't personally, this is just me, but I don't always rely on the definitions of Google that it gives, because people colloquially use the word ought in a lot of different ways,
Yeah.
that philosophy doesn't use it in. I know
Yeah.
I'm not a philosopher, but just based on my experience, they don't use ought in that way. So
Okay.
I,
Well, maybe we'll go over the philosophical ought. But I kind of came to the same conclusion 3 different ways with ought. So, um, continuing on with where was I? So I guess just by definition, that would be like what being bound by a constraint is. And then I said a regulatory constraint can or cannot be in accordance with logic or reality. And so therefore, there would be correct obligations and incorrect obligations. Or another way of putting it would be there are correct ways of acting and incorrect ways of acting. And so basically, I just concluded that having an ought means you're saying that that's the correct choice. And
well, I don't think that's what your statement concluded in eventually, because you're saying that anything which is consistent. Wait, I'm sorry. Everything. What was that you said initially? Again.
with well, the first where I started was that an ought indicates obligation or correctness.
Okay, so accepting that definition.
So, like, I guess you could say not all oughts are valid. Like, you could say
Yeah,
you
I
ought to
would
do
say
this, but you'd be wrong, kind of thing.
yeah, but your argument from like something can either be true or false, right? And therefore, and that somehow that's some things that are ought to be or ought not to be.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
and the
sorry.
third way,
It's hard for me when I drink a bunch of caffeinated stuff to hold.
yeah. So, I mean, we could just accept by definition, okay, ought means correctness, or we could say by definition,
Semantically
obligation
you
can
can
be
say
correct.
anything means anything
Yeah.
semantically.
But then the final way that I kind of derived it was just by the usage. So, like, I think everyone accepts, like, if you have this stated goal, then there are oughts that you can have. So, like, if I want to get to work this morning on time, I ought to drive.
Oh yeah,
And
100% agree.
so essentially what I think you can transform this ought into an is statement, which is using a car is the correct way to get to work quickly. And so all it means is
But you're just not stating the ought statement. You're just like choosing not to say it. You're like, the fastest way to get to work is the fastest way to. That's like saying the quickest way to get from any point to any other point is a straight line. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that you should go to any destination in a straight line.
yeah.
That presupposes the ought statements. It just hides the premises. It doesn't.
Well, I guess it hides the whether that's a goal or not. And so
It's like maybe
I
that's the
guess,
fastest way
but
to
I
get
think,
to work, but I want to go to Chili's today. Don't want
yeah,
to go to work.
but I think given a specific goal, there is a correct answer or a correct set of answers that are possible. Like you could say, okay, if I want to do math, then I ought to follow the rules of math, or you could also say these are the rules of math. And what you're really just saying is this is how to do it correctly.
Yeah. But that's not an ought. That's just an is. If you reduce anything into an is, it's just an is. Can't be an ought.
But I think the way that it's bridged is they're essentially saying the same thing, just in a different format.
So give me another one of these hypothetical imperatives, right? So like, if you want to not be hungry, eat, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a simple one. So eating is the way to stop hunger. Well,
yeah.
I just simplified it right there. I didn't even know that I was doing that. Eating is the way to stop hunger, right? If you eat,
you
are not hungry. Well, then that's just an is statement. That's just if you eat, you will not be hungry. That doesn't tell you to eat. Maybe you're already full. Maybe you are fasting. Maybe you don't want to eat. It doesn't.
Or maybe you want to feel hungry.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
This is just a simple. It just is what it originally was. It doesn't change hiding the ought statement. It's just a hypothetical imperative, no matter what you do to it, right?
Well, I think that saying that the ought is like the correct way to do something, it still doesn't tell us what we ought to do. But I think that if you take that with the 9 points that I had earlier, that then you could have a specific like objective goalposts. Like
if you assume, if you hold to a set of axioms, then one can objectively point out in reality what they should do. Obviously, 100% agreed with that. But the problem of the ought statement in relation to objectivity is where you get those axioms from. If you get them not from reality itself, then they're not objective, which you never get these axioms from reality, so therefore they can never be objective.
Well, if you derive the correct thing to do from reality,
how can you do that? I mean, in the beginning, you're
first set of premises.
What's that?
I think with that first set of premises.
No, because that presupposes what is good. As I described before, there is no system which can fulfill what everybody desires, right? So you have to presuppose what your goal is, like, right? You and I would both agree that we would strive for a world where the most amount of people. Oh, is he gone? Maybe his internet died. I don't know if the live stream is still live or not, but
Well, that was weird. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. So there's someone else in here, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I think maybe he can put in his opinion, whether he agrees with you or me.
Sure.
Peace and respect. How you doing, gentlemen?
Hey, Richard, welcome.
Really good.
To introduce myself to Lord Pasta, which feels really uncomfortable to say, so thank you for that. My name is Richard Madsen. I'm a theist. but I'm a highly unusual theist. And I say that because at age 42, I found what I consider to be compelling evidence to become a theist, which had nothing to do with any church you ever heard of.
Okay.
Okay. So on the morality thing, it strikes me that there's a possibility of an objective morality, but it would require agreement on the goal so that everyone had the same ought. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, if everybody shared the same hypothetical imperative, as in they all shared the same axiom, then their one could point to steps they could take in objective morality or reality. I always, in objective reality, you could point to the most efficient way of achieving that. Obviously, I would agree. Right.
The problem that I find with it is, how could you get an agreement? Which is where Snake says you'd have to have enforcement by the majority, but then enforcement by the majority is by definition oppression of the few.
Yeah, that is true. And that's where each individual has to ask themselves what are the bounds of what a society can and can't do to those who disagree. I mean, obviously,
what do you mean an individual has to ask themselves? What does that mean?
Well, each person individually, so I, you, anybody else, judges society according to what they believe to be right and wrong. Right. And so society, if ultimately it is true that the majority, ultimately it is true, in at least theoretically a democratic society, that a majority would exact force against those who dissent from it. It is up to that majority of people to define the bounds by which they can interact with those who dissent. So obviously,
define the bounds.
I think there's a way to put those bounds in accordance with like what is actually correct and true.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would agree, because as I discussed with Snake earlier, I believe that moral statements have truth value. So I believe that there is a correct way of doing things, right? I just don't believe that that's anywhere within what we would call objectivity, right? So I would simply appeal to how I think the world should be. I would say, I want to live in this world where people are the most free that they can be, where their needs are as taken care of as they can reasonably be without infringing on other moral principles I hold, and et cetera, et cetera. And if we set up a society around democratic principles, then I believe that gives, in certain circumstances, the majority of people the most amount of say in their lives when they're in a society interacting with other people. And so therefore that would maximize their individual autonomy, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, we can disagree on whether objectively democracy results in that or any other policy. But we can both agree that society should or should not be certain ways. Right. I'm not exactly sure what your contention is here with anything that I'm saying.
No, I'm just shooting from the hip. I'm just playing on the wave cuffs. I don't have anything that I've decided upon.
Like my view of morals, much like much like how, Snake always said, it doesn't dismiss the possibility of a deity or any set of deities or any metaphysical claim. One could hold my view and believe in God also. They would just hold that they agree with God, for whatever reason. Maybe they hold that God knows everything, and so therefore put more trust in his moral opinion than their own. That could be reasonable.
I think, not that I wanted to change topic to religious beliefs, but since you touched on it, I would touch on it briefly. That I think what Snake is beginning to consider, and what eventually all of humanity would consider and come to the conclusion of, is that the only true morality there could be would be based in what the human animal is. But in order to know that, we'd have to know fully what the human animal is, and we don't. So we'd have to have that first. But what I see in spiritual texts, ancient in nature, and uniformly proclaiming one living ancestral God, is that that's exactly what's described there, is what is actually best for the human animal.
Well, first of all, I believe that even the claim that what is described in ancient text is that which is best for the human animal. Obviously, that's presuming that there is a certain way in which is best for the human animal. And also, I don't think that the texts describe what is best for the human animal. Namely because, number one, which text?
All of them, I said that.
Okay. Well, they do contradict in some ways. I'm not here to.
What country are you from?
What country am I from?
Yes.
I am from the United States of America.
How many countries have you lived in?
I have only lived in the one country.
So you have no real cultural experience with any culture but your own.
Yeah.
But you just made the huge assumption that they disagree with each other. How would you know that?
Well, you could look at the text.
Yeah, one could look at the text.
From whose point of view? From your point of view, which is very restricted, which is what I'm pointing out.
Okay, I admit that my point of view per se is extremely restricted, but
that's fair.
I can still look up the definitions of words and compare them and derive logical contradictions therein, right?
Possibly not. Don't know. What was the context of the statement that you're critiquing? For instance, I could say that there was a great fight. And in this particular fight, the Indians slaughtered the Cowboys. And now what am I talking about?
What are you talking about? Well, it's not inherent in the statement.
Oh, sure. I was very specific.
You're talking about a scenario in which Indians slaughtered Cowboys.
Am I talking about the ancient West or football?
That's good. That's a good one.
Okay, so you can't tell, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So context is what matters, not the words so much. Without cultural context, you can't have context.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point.
Okay, that's all
I
I'm
would
saying.
agree. So one should strive to attain a holistic, nuanced understanding of different cultures and understand where the stories came from, and try and strive in the best way that they can to come to a conclusion holistically about the meaning of each.
And if we'd done what you just suggested from the start, there'd have been no wars.
If we would all just agree?
No. If we strove, as you said, if we strove to understand each culture that we met with in a holistic fashion, there'd have been no wars.
Oh, I don't know if I agree with that.
Well,
There
you
would
still have greed.
there certainly would be less wars.
Okay, fair enough.
But I don't think there would be no wars, because at the end of the day, the Nazis had a particular moral view, and the rest of Western society at the time had a contrary moral view. And if you sat someone who truly believed in Nazism down next to someone who truly believed in Western democracy, they would come down to the fundamental axiomatic disagreement of how society should be structured. And they would just simply disagree fundamentally. And so
You could be right, but I really want to get back to Snake's objective secular morality.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're never going to be able to compel everyone just by saying that something is correct. Like, especially if they can't even agree on what is correct. Like, we know that the Earth is round, but yet there are
Who's
people
we?
that think. Well, us, hopefully, at least the three
The three of us, I think, probably, yeah.
Most people. And yet there are people who just, it wouldn't matter how many times you explain why gravity is a necessity or why we've taken pictures from space. They'll always come up with some reason why it's not true. And it might be because they don't understand it. It might be because they have this emotional connection to disbelieving. But I don't think that destroys what the actual correct answer is. And that's
true.
more what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, there would have to eventually be an objective morality, not based on any kind of God belief or religion, but simply what the human animal is.
I think that's partially true. Like, I think that morality, I think morality extends beyond humans.
Really?
But, yeah.
How do you, explain that to me, because I don't understand how you could say that.
But the human ethics is going to be based on what they are. Like, someone was saying, I brought up like what something is kind of what it ought to do, and it's one and the same. Like, if you aren't doing the ought, then you aren't the thing that you're claiming you are. And someone said, okay, so why shouldn't there be an ought for slaves to obey their masters? And I was like, that's interesting. And I was kind of going down this path of like, well, the human being isn't really a slave. Like, we can create these labels and kind of force it to occur, but ontologically, I don't think humans are slaves. So
it depends on what you mean by slave and what slavery means.
Yeah, but I think part of what you say is true, but I think there's a deeper thing that would make that true. Like, humans ought to be humans, but I think there's something beyond that that's making that true. Like,
okay, so you use two different, and I would want your definitions and differentiation so I can fully understand what you meant by the difference between morality and ethics.
Yeah, I think ethics is an intelligible language of morality. Like, morality is just, I mean, at least the way I understand it, it's just, morality is just right and wrong. And ethics is like actually translating, like, what are the rules of right and wrong.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think he's right about that. I think ethics refers to like more of like a descriptive statement about how people should act. Morality is more of the mental side of it, like the conceptual side. So like outside of reality, like if you're a scientist, you have a code of ethics. That's like a code. It's written down.
Yeah.
Morality is just
science has a code of ethics.
Well, the medical profession, at least.
Certain professionals. It's not inherent in the theory of science. Like,
okay, that was it. That was my objection. Okay, keep going.
So yeah, and then morality would just be anyone saying that anything ought to be or ought not to be. Whereas ethics is a codified system, and morality is any ought statement, any set of like you should, you ought, anything like that. Really,
I think that's fair. Okay, I think I understand what you're saying.
I was talking to this guy, factitionalist, and he was saying that his morality is based on basically the survival of a species, kind of how a species has the right to exist. And I thought
Wow.
that also is like close, but not quite. Like I do largely base my system on something ought exist, and like the more things that you can get to coexist, I think is better, just by the at least by the definition that I use. And then I
For the
think
fact of more options.
yeah, but I
Okay.
think that can also be said is correct in reality and hopefully doesn't have like logical flaws. So
The
and
gentleman you were speaking to, is he a eugenicist or is he just inconsistent?
yeah, I have multiple problems with that idea that groups of like say species or even subgroups of humans have the right to exist, like in perpetuity, in like forever or something like that. I would say that one could hypothetically propose a race of beings which is created maybe artificially, maybe not, but just in their entire existence is suffering. Like that's just inherent to them. Like every second is suffering. They don't have a right to exist. They should go extinct.
Why?
Right? They should go extinct because their non-existence reduces the amount of suffering.
Have you ever used heroin?
No.
You see, the use of heroin results in a lack of physical suffering, a complete lack of physical suffering.
Well,
I've met many men your age who tried heroin and said, I did not realize that my blank hurt until I tried heroin. How do you know that you're not suffering right now? And if they were in continuous suffering, how would they know that?
well, understanding what suffering is a very complex topic. But in the context of the hypothetical, it is simply assumed that these beings suffer.
Suffer compared to what and how? Or you just mean theoretically suffer, because there may be no such thing.
Well, in a hypothetical, well, okay, so there may be no such thing as suffering?
There may not be any such thing as suffering.
Interesting.
For instance, let's say I were born with a mental defect where I had a nerve dysfunction, and that nerve dysfunction constantly told my body that I was in pain. Am I in pain?
If the experience is analogous to what I would experience as pain, then I would define you as in pain.
Okay,
and
so
what
let's
you're
take
describing
the opposite.
appears to be yes.
Let's take the opposite. Some people are incapable of feeling physical pain because of an opposite effect from development. So can they be in pain?
Those people that you describe, no, they can't be in pain. But the pain is not the only relevant moral trait that I would.
I was just making one example. There's several, as you say.
Yeah, so I would say that person can't feel pain.
I think pain and suffering is
they're not
is an interesting topic, whereas like suffering may be necessary to build character or to overcome obstacles so that you can do more, or pain is necessary so that you can tell when your body's damaged and so I think don't damage it worse. And even the death of a species, like that may be necessary in the inherent rules of how reality works in order for them to have ever existed at all. Like there may be no way to actually have an eternally existing species, and probably isn't.
Right.
So
If we had 100% humans that were just like Paris Hilton, we'd have no empathy for anyone, and the species would not survive.
Mhm.
Well, I think that, like I said earlier, pain. I feel like it's very reductive to just say that we should reduce pain, because pain is just one way someone can suffer.
Depends on what you mean by pain.
Yeah, one could define pain as any form of suffering, which, like, one could theoretically propose a great multitude of different beings which exist with pure suffering in any specific psychological sense. Like, one could be experiencing intense existential, like, dread, fear, pain. One could be experiencing physical pain. One could be feeling the pain of never being able to realize what it wants to do. Like, everything it does fails, right? Just in perpetuity, right? And so all these different things I would define as ways that people can suffer, but they're not all the same. And in each of those scenarios, I would say that a group of, say, beings which has only that trait inherently, while they shouldn't go through any more suffering, they perhaps should not be encouraged to exist. Not as an individual.
Why? Because they're suffering in some way. Is that why?
Well, not in any individual sense. So I wouldn't say it's morally justified to kill them.
Okay, well, I'm going to say that if your mom thought that way and you're more than the first child, if you're after the first child, you shouldn't exist.
I don't,
because there's definitely suffering involved in birthing a child and being pregnant. And she knew it.
Well, maybe she derived a pleasure from the thought of raising a child, and she, weighed the benefits and the risks and all of that, and she came to the conclusion that it would be more pleasurable to her to have children and bring new life into the world, which is something that I completely understand.
Well, what if a species existed that was in constant mental anguish and physical pain, but there was a flower that they really liked looking at?
Then I think that we should do all that we can to provide them with those flowers, insofar as it doesn't cause suffering to other beings. And maybe I would also hold that maybe they shouldn't reproduce if they are so immensely in suffering.
Well, wait. That they feel like the flower is more important than their suffering.
Oh, well, then they should be allowed to reproduce then, because ultimately, if there's no hard way for me to quantify suffering, right?
Right.
I have to appeal to what I know. Like, I would have to gauge the responses of these beings. I would have to, see how they interact on a very basal level. And if they truly do derive this amount of pleasure from the flower, enough to weigh out the suffering they experience in their life, then of course they should reproduce and create more ultimately.
So let's say, just for instance, you met Stephen Hawking about 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He's already a well-recognized scientist in his field.
All right.
I want you to finish it.
I met Stephen Hawking. I'm sorry. Is there something that I'm supposed to?
You're talking about suffering.
Do you kill him or do you not kill him?
That's the question. You murder him or not?
Oh no, that's not what
Why
I'm
not?
saying at all. Because I believe that. Okay, I tried to explain this earlier. Whereas I would never kill. I said even the suffering beings that are suffering immensely, I would never say that it is morally justified to kill them.
But you said they should die off.
I said that they should perhaps not reproduce.
That's dying off.
Yeah, but it's not killing any of them. They all die eventually. Everybody dies.
You have a hard time proving that. I'm just saying you have. I mean, I wouldn't go down that road if I was you.
Well, die given one definition of die. I would admit that I'm
going with the classic definition of die.
Okay.
You're just going to have a hard time showing that your statement is true, but that's another topic, maybe for another day. Okay, so what is it that makes a life worth having?
What makes it worth living, I guess is what you're saying. Subjective enjoyment and content with that life.
Okay.
And we should strive in all ways to make sure that we act in ways which are in accordance with that as far as we can. If we can't, then we make assumptions. We're not always right, though. If there's an animal that can't communicate with people, and it's everything in its brain says that it's suffering like needlessly, and it's suffering in this manner, but we can't ultimately know anything. I personally wouldn't say we should kill that animal, but maybe we should just not allow for, like, we should try and make ways for them not to exist in perpetuity. That word is hard for me to say for some reason, but you
perpetuity.
Perpetuity, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Right? I wouldn't
so
the killing of any group of people.
So dwarves typically have medical problems.
Yeah, well, you would ask the dwarves, are you happy with your life even given this situation? Most of them say yes, and they go on with their lives,
But there's a relatively low risk of them, two dwarves, having a child that is a dwarf.
Well, they should be able. I'm not saying
that there is that risk.
No, you misunderstand what I'm saying. We can ask a dwarf. We can say, dwarf, you are content with your life, right? And they'll say yes.
You're
and
a
if
dwarf.
we ask enough dwarves, and they're all converging on this idea that, oh, any suffering that I'm experiencing, I don't really attribute that to inherently being a dwarf. I mean, even though I have all these medical problems or something like that, then it's totally fine for them to reproduce. I have no problem. I'm not some eugenicist. I'm really not at all.
I'm just trying to narrow down your definitions because you were speaking in too broad of statements for my liking.
Understandable.
That's all. I'm just trying to understand. Okay.
Understandable.
All right. So there's a risk that two people who have dwarfism, if they are a couple or even if they're not both dwarfs, that a child could be born of that coupling, and that child end up with the same predisposition of dwarfism and thereby will suffer. Should they reproduce or not?
Well,
what about
everybody
a more debilitating disability?
Yeah, well, dwarf, you can ask a dwarf. You can say, is your life worth living? And most of them say that it is, because they're not killing themselves. Some of them do, but that might be more of a societal problem.
What about someone with microcephaly or something, like where very low chance of them surviving at all, if even to adulthood, and that survival, whatever existence they might have, might be complete suffering while they're still alive in the hospital?
It's impossible for us to someone with that condition. Some of them you can ask, but most of them you can't.
Yeah.
And in that, you have to. Sometimes you do have to make assumptions, but in that specific case, I would say no, because ultimately that person is at a state where I don't think they're going to understand fully the gravity of their situation, and they're not really going to understand their own suffering, really. And it would be a net loss to society and the people who maybe value that person to say, or just as a precedent in general, to say that we should just euthanize these people. You know, I wouldn't, I'm very reluctant to say that there's any circumstance in which you should euthanize a person, even if they're like measurably in like horrid pain, because pain is only one type of suffering, in my view. I mean, I feel like most people would agree with that. There are existential suffering, there's physical suffering, there's the suffering of a lack of something, right? There is the lack of well-being, which in of itself may be suffering, right?
Well, and what do you guys think? I was thinking of an analogy, kind of maybe more for my moral system, but in terms of like allowing a range of things to exist, like a range of suffering, like I guess I would use an analogy of like free speech, where you can simultaneously allow speech that is flawed to exist, but as long as you're allowing all of it to exist, then you're going to have this whole range of like the good speech and the bad speech. And so if you have any other system, then you like a curation system where only a certain speech is allowed, then you're going to both cut off things that should exist, and you're going to promote things that shouldn't exist. But if you just let them all exist, and maybe according to their own will, then you're going to have all of it. You're going to get all of the good and at least some of the bad, but people can also be able to choose for themselves which they filter through.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very in favor of free speech, even though I do hold to a lower level that people should be nice to each other. I don't think that the correct response to someone being mean is to throw them in prison, because that creates more suffering for them. I mean, what it just doesn't, the analysis of it just doesn't add up.
Yeah.
Right. The correct response is to tell them don't be mean, or to disassociate with them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Richard, what do you think about the measurement of freedom as a good thing?
I think the measurement of freedom is, I don't know, it seems fundamentally intuitive, and that's fine. Okay. And that seems to me that it would at least allow for the individual to aggress themselves so that they can be what they perceive as happy. So in that way, I can agree with that. But there's inherent problems with it too. Like, what if I say that I don't know all things? Okay. So because it's a truism that I don't know all things, I have to work in percentages of accuracy of what reality is, because I don't know. Mm-hmm. So then, am I in fact, with those freedoms, exercising things that would be beneficial to myself and others in my surroundings and to the human race as a whole? Well, maybe not. And how would I know? I can't. So freedom is not I contest that freedom is not a good thing to the uninformed. For instance, you could teach a small child to start a car and put it in gear. That's giving them more freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
But they're probably going to kill themselves. That's not a good thing to them as a being.
Yeah, that's
that's
the concept of you need to be informed to make consent.
Yeah.
I fundamentally agree with that. So
in the example of a nuclear weapon, we set off the first one, and some people thought it might catch the atmosphere on fire.
Yeah.
And the best calculations we had it at 1/3 the size that it actually was. And We had several platoons of military personnel marching within blast range when it went.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we had the freedom to do that.
Yeah. Well, the started with the first example, like allowing kids to drive, I think actually reduces the amount of freedom, because then you're going to have a bunch of dead kids and dead people. So I think
Dead people can't be free.
yeah, I think it's kind of an illusion. Like, it's almost a paradox. It's kind of like saying, well, I'm free to kill everyone. That would
Right.
be like
Like,
contradictory.
you can't be
That's
free
not
to
true freedom
enslave
for the group.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So-
exactly.
So I think I'm going to need you to tell me what ultimately what freedom is.
I'm not talking about just like ultimate individual freedom to do whatever you want. It's more like I don't know how much you caught, but it's basically the total amount of things that a system can do. And so if you have certain ethics that are basically reducing that, like if the ethic is letting kids drive, then you're going to end up with less freedom, not in the sense of like things that you're allowed to do,
Sure.
but you're just going to have less people, so there's going to be less getting done and less decisions being made. And
Well, you wouldn't have had to say that today. I mean, I know your first name's Taylor. We know each other, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. And you've said these things before, and I understand that as a whole.
Okay.
I'm just presenting little problems with it, working my way toward an ultimate argument.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I generally agree with the concept of consent must be informed to be true consent. But I also think that people are happiest when they feel in control of themselves. And so, therefore, I agree that we should maximize the amount of freedom that individuals have without, obviously unreasonable lengths. Like people can't sell themselves into slavery, uh, for obvious reasons. Uh, but interactions that are not between people, but are instead um, personal decisions, I feel like those are the right of the individual. They may not be informed, and that's the fault of someone whose responsibility it really was to inform them about things.
Mhm.
I think we should inform people. I think that's like a societal thing that we should do. We should strive to inform people. But I feel like building a society where, with the philosophy that, oh, everybody's stupid, and they'll make decisions that will hurt themselves. I think, well, of course, people will do things to hurt themselves. But that doesn't mean that we should throw away freedom, because the joy that people get through personally pursuing their own desires and where they find beauty in the world is so wholly unique to every individual that I feel like that's something that we need to grant people. Right.
Well, I also think there's no way really to suppress most like bad actions without making things worse on yourself. Like the drug war, first of all, it's not even effectual, but and it takes away a lot more freedoms than the ability to make the personal choice to get high on drugs. So it is kind of a paradox where getting addicted to drugs is a bad thing, but having the ability to make that choice for yourself is a good thing. And
because the alternative, having
the alternative is worse. Yeah.
Institution, the state having so much power, and it causes so much problem that it's more suffering than the drug would cause on its own. A good example of that is Portugal, where they basically legalized everything, and then the rates of overdosing went down.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure quite why that is. Maybe it's because people are just
because
they don't think that it's like their last score or their,
Yeah, they have they regulated it. They had areas where people could go to get help, all that stuff. Drugs are one of those things that like alter reality, and I'm very skeptical of things that like alter reality. I don't like
yeah.
them, and they can consume your life, and they can
Well, it's
do
kind
all.
of like what like chastity only sexual education is. Ironically, those have the highest when they teach chastity only or abstinence only. That those are where the highest rates of teen pregnancy is. So if you actually allow people to make the wrong decision, they end up making the correct decision more often. I mean, at least in those cases. Obviously, we can't allow murder
Yeah,
as
well,
a choice.
because they're informed.
Yeah,
People need to be
yeah.
informed about what they can and can't do with themselves.
Not to be completely sarcastic, Lord Pasta, but why do you think people take drugs other than to alter their reality?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different types of drugs. Some of them specifically alter reality, like LSD, DMT, psilocybin.
Which ones don't alter reality?
Which ones don't?
Yeah.
Maybe something like morphine, which just makes you feel really good.
Does it make the ability to sense pain go away?
Oh, it does.
Yes.
But
are they actually in pain while they're not sensing it? Yes, they are.
Yeah, but in that sense, a lot of things
Or should they be?
All drugs would be drugs. Like eating food makes hunger go away. Is food a drug?
Yes, it's a series of chemicals, but in this case, it's actually beneficial to the body as a whole. It's not altering reality; it's solving a problem.
I can concede that all drugs alter reality. Yes,
Okay.
but
sugar is a drug.
There are some ways that alter reality which are productive, and there are some ways which are not. And ultimately, with what I've seen on the very like psychedelic drugs, it's a very mixed bag, because naturally each mind is different. Each mind will have a unique experience, and that experience can either be extremely positive and result in a great amount of well-being for not only one individual but for the world, because they treat people differently. But on the other hand, somebody can freaking take LSD and basically be comatose for like months, and like be depersonalized from their body in a state of like suffering. It's horrible if you look at like written experiences or listen to personal experience of things. So it's a very mixed bag with that kind of thing. And so the fact that you really don't know what you're going to get, I would just say don't. Just in general, it's not a good idea to mess with that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't say anyone's not allowed to, And I'm not saying there's no value in it either. There definitely is.
I think there is a value in exploring altered states of consciousness. Not necessarily like meth or heroin types, but because we know the consequences of those. But yeah, I do hold stock in some hallucinogens.
The great unknown of the human mind is fascinating. But how much can you really garner from a substance that has such, vastly differentiating like effects on people? And there's some things that tie all the experiences together, but the outcome can be very different from person to person.
Yeah. I think that's something you just have to experience.
Like one person vapes some THC and is just super chill and like wants to make love to the universe or something. The other person has a panic attack.
Hmm.
Well, I mean,
But
what's
I think
the differentiating factor is the person and how
trying
we're
it,
supposed to know.
I think trying it ultimately is the better option, at least with some drugs. Like some, you shouldn't risk it. Like meth, not even once. But it's kind of like trying foods. Like, would you rather? Like, I'm a picky person, so I get this a lot. Would you rather
I
go?
am too.
Yeah, would you rather go your whole life not knowing what you're missing, or would you rather maybe have like this really temporary bad experience, or you might have a good experience and add that to your life for the rest of your life?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole idea of you should try and like experience a lot of things, within reason, because ultimately, yeah, a lot of that's going to be bad, but a lot of it's going to be good too.
Mhm.
Um, that whole idea is hard to sell on certain, people like myself who have high levels of anxiety. But even though I
Yeah.
know it's true, um, on a rational level, it's very hard to get oneself to do that. You
Mhm.
know.
Wait a minute, Taylor. I got to ask you, man. Was that an actual quote from one of your actual parents? Because it sounded like it was.
Probably. Yeah.
Meth, not even once.
It's been
So when did they
Matt.
have to start using psychology on you? How old were you? Like 7? I mean,
with trying things.
yeah. When
Yeah.
was
Oh, that
I think
thing.
the first time you heard that one?
Oh yeah, it's been drilled into me by many people.
Hey,
Okay.
look, my
Yeah.
parents used to say the same thing, and look how I turned out. Didn't make
Yeah.
a difference.
My girlfriend's the one who says it now mostly.
Yeah. Now I say it to myself, even
Yeah.
though I don't believe it. Well, I
Yeah.
do believe it, but I just can't. It's you can believe something, but you can't get yourself to act on it.
Well, and it applies to a lot of things too. It's like just try it. What's the worst that could happen? And sometimes the worst that could happen is too much to try it. But I think that's part of the judgment call.
Yeah. I mean, when I was little, I was a very picky eater, and the one thing my family would always do, they kind of like enforced it. I don't think they thought they were enforcing it, but like it really did. Is the only time that they would ask me to eat new things was at like massive family get-togethers. So like the entire extended family would be there. We'd all be sitting down, and they'd put something I've never seen before in front of me. And of course, I don't want to eat it, but like it's in front of everybody. They're like, "Yeah, you have to eat it." And it's like that's like the worst possible situation you could be like putting someone into, like putting them on the spot. Everyone's staring at you. You don't want to eat the thing, and if you like show hesitation, you're just deeper in the hole. And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
I have a friend who's obviously homophobic, but he likes hallucinogenic drugs, and was asking me if I'd ever tried any, and I said no. I just am not interested in that sort of thing. That does not sound appealing to me. And I know that about myself. And he says, well, how do you know if you've never tried? I said, have you ever laid with a man?
Try it.
Well, how do you know? You should go have homosexual sex today, according to your theory.
well, I mean, according to Snake, I mean,
Don't knock it till you try it. That's what I'm saying. I mean, I actually would recommend that he
hey,
should go
same.
try it, so he knows.
I would
But
probably say the same thing, but sarcastically.
yeah, I mean, at some point, yeah, like the more things that you can add to your life, I think the better. But at some point, if you're like the yes man, if you just say yes to everything, then I think that
Yeah,
can be disabling as well.
that's bad. Also, true.
Yeah,
It's a balance.
yeah,
It's a balancing act.
yeah. I think if you're not attracted to a man, though, you probably already
Yeah,
know how it's gonna go.
yeah.
But maybe just close your eyes. Maybe you'll like it anyway.
Hey, look, if you close your eyes, is it really gay though? Because you're not like.
Yeah.
Yes, it's really gay.
I had this argue. These are like the kinds of Discord arguments I have.
Well, and you'll see sometimes on like pamphlets, like sex education or like LGBT stuff. It'll be like gay men, bisexual men, and men who have sex with men.
What?
Like yeah, like
How's there a differentiation there?
I guess you
like an all
you know.
saying, I guess. You know.
I mean, I guess some people just take a wet hole as a wet hole. And
Maybe. I mean,
doesn't matter what's attached to them so much.
Oh, okay. I would just think that would be extremely specialized and not. I mean, a very small percentage of even a very small percentage of people. But
Yeah,
anyway.
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so Snake, I was considering execution of the objective morality.
Uh-huh.
And in a debate with SJ, you said something to the effect of enforcement.
Yeah.
Would you expound on enforcement and see if you went the same? I want to see if your brain goes the same place mine did.
Well, I guess I was trying to describe like a justified enforcement.
Sure. Well, let's assume it's justified.
Yeah, I think that was in reference to like how I would convince Stalin or Mao to stop them doing what they're doing. And I think I said something like
no, it was right before that.
You could try to convince them with reason, but
it was right before that.
Okay.
So you hadn't gotten to Stalin Mao, but you were voluntarily you were finishing up an idea and said something to the effect of the consensus objective would have to be enforced. So I just want to know how you would enforce it.
Well, you can, I guess, if you're assuming that people won't follow it themselves.
Well, there's going to be, I mean, there's always outliers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess with police or something like that, some kind of law enforcement, or you might have to go to war. Because sometimes enforcement is.
I thought of a gentler way.
Okay.
My brain immediately went to CRISPR.
Okay. So force them to accept your genetic
alteration
changes. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about that? It'd be nonviolent.
Well, how would you catch them?
No, they would have had to have messed up first, or we could start doing blood tests on people. How about that? We start identifying the medical problem before it actually manifests as a social problem.
Like, how do you reform someone who's already did a crime?
No, let's say for instance, and we have identified a few things. We can take a sample of the amniotic fluid and say this child is going to blah, blah, blah. You know, because we see these raised or lowered statistical chemical situations.
Like editing out psychopathy, if you could possibly do that?
Yes, like that.
I don't know. There are some useful psychopaths out there, so
I did like the series. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say there was a book, I forget what it's called, but it just went over like what roles psychopaths have in our lives, and like a lot of doctors tend to be psychopaths, and they're good at it because they're just emotionally cold, and they don't have the best bedside manner, but the intricacies and technicalities of the medical profession, they're able to do that without getting upset or distracted about certain things, and that could be useful. It's probably not as Well, it's probably useful in business, but not useful for the people who aren't benefiting. Like psychopaths are good businessmen, but they're pretty much only benefiting themselves
Mm-hmm.
or their company that they're working for, because they're ruthless. They have no conscience.
Right.
So I guess I would say that's something you should probably just let manifest, and then if it's too much of a burden on society, then you should enforce it.
Okay, so now I was just trying to propose a gentle form of enforcement.
Yeah.
But still, you'd have to be right that there would have to be some kind of enforcement, some kind.
Yeah.
Now, so especially 75 and more years ago, it would have to have been violence. But science is getting to the point now where it's soon wouldn't be necessary, or almost isn't necessary right now. But so the ultimately my mind came to this: no matter how enforced what you are doing in that enforcement, even if a majority decided it was objective, and of course that minority would not, they would not agree that it's objective. They would not arrive at that should. They would not want to comply because personal reasons ABC.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately what you have is a majority that is enforcing their view on a minority.
Yeah.
So how do you get around the oppression?
Well, if you wanted to use the word oppression, I guess I could say that there is justified oppression and unjustified oppression. I think
interesting. Expound on that.
I would say it's justified force versus unjustified force, where I guess I would say that something like killing is always wrong, but there's a justified killing in that, yeah, it's bad that a life had to be taken, but if the person who died was the aggressor, they're the ones who violated I don't know if you want to call it a contract or the moral code by being the aggressor. And so you have a right to enforce the moral code if you're the one defending yourself, because that person is the one who broke it. So you're the one who's more in line with what is correct, and so you can enforce what is correct. And they don't have a right to defend the incorrect breaking of the code, if that makes sense. So you could say serial killers are the minority, but they've obviously violated ethics and morality and are doing the wrong thing, and so it's justified to stop them.
That makes sense to me. I mean, most moral philosophies abide by the use of violence, right? Like, most people agree that somewhere violence has to be used. To just say that violence ought not happen is, I don't know. This one can say that in a perfect world there should be no violence, but in the world in which people take rights from others, which is the one that we live in now, violence is the only way that we know of stopping that from occurring. So I would agree. And as Demolished Doctrine proposed, maybe CRISPR is a way of eliminating some problems. However, even mentally sane humans still commit a lot of crimes, still do a lot of horrible things. Actually, I think the mentally ill commit less crimes than the mentally sane per capita. I believe, I don't know, I could be wrong about that. But yeah, some conditions like if it were possible to isolate the gene for like just being violent without any cause, without any impetus, then yeah, we should eliminate that. We should I wouldn't say like maybe like after the child is born, like if someone is born with that gene, hunt them down and like genocide them or something. I would never say that, but you know, like maybe like recommend it to parents, that sort of a thing.
Yeah.
You know,
I don't have that many objections to genetic editing, especially since it's going to be it's inevitable eventually.
mm-hmm. Hey, look, there's not going to be a lot of people looking like me in 200 years. That's all I'm going to say.
Wow. Yeah, it's going to change a lot. We're going to have some weird things running around this earth.
Yeah, well, I mostly meant that people won't be 5'4" and
Oh, you look tall to me, so
really,
I couldn't tell.
I'm like really tiny.
Really
That was my nickname.
tiny.
Teeny tiny Tony.
Ah,
That's my name.
well, I'm sorry for that.
No, I take pride in it. It's the only thing you can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, was there anything else that you guys wanted to touch on?
I think I've tried to express my perspective and my critique of your objective moral framework the best that I could. Sometimes when I listen back to myself talking, I'm like, oh my goodness, why did you try and explain it in that way? It's it's so
Yeah.
convoluted. And so I assume that I explained something because you seem to like concede to a lot of the fundamental points I was making. So, um, you know, I like talking about this kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, and we should definitely have a follow up. Or you're on Twitter?
well, I have an account somewhere
Yeah.
on Twitter.
I've started using it a little more lately, just for conversing. It used to be on Facebook a lot more, but I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to use like there are a lot of debaters who use Discord. I mean,
Yeah, I was gonna get into that.
yeah, it's there's a ton. It's not just gaming, although I do on my channel I do gaming. It's mostly just background stuff where I
Yeah.
talk around about random BS. Um, but yeah, always good to talk about the crazy topics like does morality actually exist?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I'm gonna have to think more about your criticism of the Izot thing. Uh, I still think that if you can phrase the same statement as an ought, that it is a true ought.
You understand how that's just like a hypothetical imperative, but you're just not saying the ought premise. You're just saying you're just saying the then, not the if.
Yeah, but I think you can if it's essentially saying the same thing, different structure.
Yeah, an if then statement, a hypothetical imperative does not bridge the is-ought gap, unless you claim they do. They definitely appeal to things in reality, but things in reality are what we value. Unless we valued some, we could value concepts, but concepts can exist as concepts, so we value them.
Yeah. Well, I think if you figure out what is correct to do, then could you figure out the is-ought gap?
If you could figure out what is correct to do, well, yeah, that would solve the is-ought gap. But the problem is you never can.
This is exactly why I'm saying you'd have to know exactly what the human animal actually is.
I feel like there are some problems with even that, but
Why?
well, knowledge of how the human animal is simply an is statement. It doesn't say anything about how.
Right, but we're working toward objective. That's what we're talking about. In order to have objective, you'd have to have purely what is.
If you only have what is, you can't have what ought.
No, but you just said, and I agree with you, that if you had the is there, that would already imply the ought. You don't have to decide what the ought is.
What I mean is that I was describing what Snake was doing insofar as you start with a premise. You start with a statement like this. If I want to be full, I should eat.
Right.
Right. Which is obviously something we'd all agree with, right? If food satisfies hunger. And Snake is saying that could be reduced to the statement, food satisfies hunger. But that's just omitting the statement that you desire to be full, right? You could desire to not be full. You could be fasting, right?
Well, isn't that kind of the practice of objectivity is trying to eliminate personal desires?
Yeah, but all ought statements are personal desires. That's the problem. Right? Like
unless there was something correct outside of them, right?
Yes. I mean, if to bridge the is-ought gap, you would have to have the objectively best way of existing. But because best implies subjective preference, because everybody thinks different things are best.
Then use what is detrimental and what is, instead of using best.
Well, that's kind of what Sam Harris does, but why should we do things which are not detrimental? And why can't I value something that is quote unquote detrimental? And everything, like there's an opportunity cost to everything. So like doing X, Y, or Z may detriment your ability to do like A or Y, you know? So you have to make a choice. It's not always clear. And because different people value different things. Like, you know, some people like the color blue. Some people like the color red, you know? Some people are going to want to maximize their association with the color red, and some people are going to want to maximize their association with the color blue. And so they're going to have to take exclusive paths, right? There's no way to have maximum red and maximum blue, because
yes, there is.
All the
I choose purple.
Well, I think I don't know if I said that's good.
Because any space your viewpoint could have both, could also have the same, which would be more of one, right? Like,
well, it's like so I don't know if I finished my statement about the universally preferable behavior, which I use to derive universally applicable behavior. So like you could never get an ought from like should I have chocolate or vanilla? But I think you can say that you ought to have both chocolate and vanilla, because then the choice is you have both choices that are possible. And so
yes, but there's obviously a better flavor.
Chocolate.
Yeah. Well, some days I'm feeling chocolate, some days I'm feeling vanilla, but most of the time it's chocolate.
Well, I think
so. I'd want a world in which I was I was surrounded by chocolate to the proportion to which I want chocolate. But
I think you only chose chocolate as a point of rebellion because it's universally true that human babies like vanilla and not chocolate.
Well, I agree with that. When I was a baby, I liked vanilla, but now I'm a man. I like chocolate. Okay,
You're just being rebellious against yourself. You won't admit what you are.
Yeah, well, I think you can see the point that I'm making here, right? Like, everybody makes decisions. There's opportunity cost to everything, and while there is a world in which everybody achieves the maximum amount of well-being they can without at the detriment of others, right? That is something that objectively exists. That is a world that exists in objective reality. That does not necessarily mean that world ought to exist, right? Because some people, what they desire won't be present in that world. Some people want non-existence. They can never achieve non-existence in any possible world. So there's no possible way that maximally moral world, just to label it as something, would have it. There's just no way it could, because as Snake already proved in his logical syllogism, nothingness can't exist, right? Like, because nothingness is something, and if it's something, it can't be nothing, and so
Yeah, and I think from that we can derive that things existing ought to be, and I think the only way to
value existence, because all you value is in existence. So you could value something that is not in existence. You could value non-existence.
Yeah, but I don't care about personal values. Like, you could be wrong about that. Like, but I think the only way you can,
Yeah,
I think things existing is an ought, but I think the only way to kind of rank that is like which ones allow the most other things to exist.
But how can you say things ought to exist when there is nothing inherent to existence which states that? There's nothing inherent to existence which proves that existence ought to exist other than it is, and you can't derive an ought from an is. And so the realm of ought is entirely separate from the realm of is. It just is incomprehensible for me to be able to conceive of pointing to any object in the world and saying there's something that I must do with that object. There's just nothing you can name. There are things that there are scenarios in which I would be compelled by my moral impetus to act in certain ways, but that's a wholly subjective experience, as I described earlier. Although I agree that morals have truth value, that is something that is not in objective reality, or that which we call objective reality. That's something which is above the model of reality. It's on the level of raw experience.
Yeah, I don't think I get what you're saying. Like, there might not be an ought for a specific thing. Like, if I've got a lump of iron in front of me, like, what ought I do? I might not have an ought to do anything with it because I don't know. I don't have a forge, or I don't know what to do with a piece of iron.
Yeah, the important thing is that ought statements almost definitionally, like, can't be in existence. Like, unless you define ought as meaning something which is, in which case that would not be what most moral philosophers are referring to, right? Like, we can imagine a world where the majority of minds experience self-actualization and pleasure and least amount of suffering, we can imagine that world. Hypothetically, it can exist, right? But in that world, there will always be things which you can't do, right? Like, say in the most moral world, you can't rape people. Well, maybe somebody just like doesn't care about anything else other than having sex with someone, and they don't care if it's consensual. Like, there's nothing you can point to say that they can't. You know, there's nothing you can't say you ought not with any objective backing. You can say that it's wrong to rape.
Well, that's where
I agree, but you can't point to. They're just going contradictory to something that has the most amount of well-being for the most amount of people.
Hey, fellas.
Not for them. Yeah.
I don't think. No, that was the end of the statement. So you guys have a real good night. And it was interesting. And thanks for letting me hang out with you for a little bit. And it was nice to meet you. I believe you said your name was Tony.
Yeah, you can call me Lord Poster, whatever.
It's very weird calling anyone Lord anything.
I get it.
If I could call you Pasta, that would be fine.
Totally cool. You can call me.
Totally cool. All right. You guys have a great night. See you around, Taylor. I want to explore more with your brain, okay?
Yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for coming.
All right. Have peace. Have peace, Pasta.
Peace.
See ya. Yeah. What was I? Oh, that's why I call it universally applicable behavior, because I think you can universalize some ethic where there is like where people can self-actualize until the point where you can't do things that are possible. And I think rape would be something that would contradict a universally applicable ethic.
As much as I value having sex with people, I don't value it to the point where I would allow like the world to like have someone rape me. Like I wouldn't want to live in a world where that was permitted, you know? And any situation that I can imagine myself in, at the end of the day, I would rather be in a relationship with someone that was consensual than in one that wasn't, because and no other reason other than I would have more pleasure from the one that's consensual, you know?
Well, and it's kind of in the definition of like rape is a sexual encounter that you don't want. So it's not possible to want to get raped.
Oh, true. This is the whole it's impossible to want to be stolen from thing that Stefan does all the time. Hey, look, I am not a fan of Stefan for a number of reasons. I'm not a fan of Harris for a number of reasons, but you know, I respect the attempt to bridge the Izot gap, but they just don't do it at all. Nobody I've seen so far has been able to. So
yeah, well,
you're by far the one that I agree with the most, but I still disagree with the gap thing.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I like part of both of their models, but I just don't think it goes far enough. I guess for similar reasons as you.
Yeah.
Because it's always like, okay, so why should suffering be bad? And why should happiness be good?
Yeah, that's the question you can ask at the end of all of it, you know.
Yeah. But I think that, so for me, the ice cream example is the most poignant one, where it's like you can eliminate the conflict if you have both options.
Yeah, but you only want one.
But that's fine as long as there's both options. I don't care if someone else has vanilla. You know?
Yeah, because it doesn't matter as much. But like, if you talk about other things, like people want to be loved, right? Um, but like, well, maybe that's not the best example. But like, say someone values, say the color red, just in of itself, or like someone values, having a bunch of money, or X, like they value X trait, right? They value, yeah, X trait, we'll just say. Um, well, X, let's say, um, the perfect world for them would be a world just full of X, right? It would just have X.
Mm-hmm.
And their amount of well-being and like contentment would just be, their brain would explode with like, how happy they would be with X, even if X didn't sustain them, maybe they'd die, they'd be happy with that just because they had X. I mean, that's them. Who knows? And so, but every space that X takes up in a given universe can also be taken up by Y, which someone else values,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the perfect world for them would be a world totally full of Y everywhere. Now, if those two people exist in the same universe, what would be the perfect world for them? One with equal X and Y, right? But the problem is now that the both of them still have moral impetus to want a world full of X's and Y's,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're partially sustained, so to speak. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We all have a perfect world. Like the perfect world for every individual is different. Like mine has like freaking towering imperial architecture everywhere, and we live on the moon of a giant gas giant, and everybody is like exactly as attractive as I say that they should be, and they all want to have sex with me, and I constantly eat everything that tastes good. Right? That's the perfect world for me. But
Mm-hmm.
that's never going to be, because that can't exist in the same world as other people. And so rationally, I have to settle for a different world, because I don't want to have everybody just warring with each other over the perfect world that they want for themselves, because that causes even more suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we make consensus. We just say, okay, we just disagree. You have yours, I'll have mine.
Yeah, and I think
But that's not objective.
that's kind of partially what I'm trying to get to, where things that are able to coexist, and yeah, I
That's
think
not objective, because I still think that world ought to be in the end. Like I still think that, to like a very low level, that everything should be that way,
well, I think
I
you
feel like
can say
everybody
that you ought to experience that. Sure, it would be
it's like everybody thinks
it,
they
it
are.
would be it would be better if you could somehow experience that, whether it was
If
whether
I
you
were
could
the only
create your own pocket dimension where that were true, or
yeah,
some
if I were the
virtual
only human in
reality.
existence, then I guess one could say that objectively. Well, yeah, in that case, if I were the only human that existed, even then I couldn't say that was objectively what the world should be, because there's nothing in objectivity other than, because the fact that should be just is,
Yeah.
like us things just are.
Well,
And so equally then, the world where we're all existing and we make consensus is not objective either, because the idea that we should have consensus and not instead kill everybody else is still an odd claim, which is just true because it is. And so you're faced with the same problem.
Well, I think I definitely try to eliminate desires and perspectives because of the objective. My goal is to make it objective.
So you start out with a goal and you try and prove it.
Well, at least, I mean, I think those are the constraints I put on myself for objectivity. If it exists, it can't have
objectivity to exist. So you try and prove it. Like,
well,
it doesn't seem very
well.
specific.
I take that, but I do want it to exist, but it doesn't matter.
I want it to exist too.
It doesn't matter if I want it to, but if it does exist, then it's going to have the quality of not having to rely on desires, right?
Hey, look, facts may not care about your feelings, but feelings don't care about facts either.
That's true. Well, that may be a good place to leave it at then.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, it was a good talk.
One last thing. Could I like put this on my channel? Like.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Feel free.
I have 400 subs now, so still bigger than you.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'll have to go subscribe, and I can send you the file if you want, or if you were recording.
I'm not recording now, but I can get it from your channel once it's done.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
I don't do typically content like this, so I don't know if I'd recommend you subscribe, but if you want to, I'm always free to do discussions like this while I'm live streaming at any time. So
yeah. I might get some of your advice on how to set up the game thing, because I've been curious about that. Like, I think people would like to watch a game being played and then while someone's talking about it.
Like Destiny does, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. But have a good day.
All right. Yeah, you too, man. See ya. There you go, folks.